Now then, we're going to look in more detail at our first widget, the text view. So we can see it right there, both in the component tree and in the app preview. That is the text view that we're given by default in this app. So let's zoom in and see it in a bit more detail. There we go. So Hello World is the standard starting point for all new apps and new app developers. But let's customize that a little bit. So we can start by just double clicking on it, and you can see we're then given the option to change the text and change the ID if we want to. So just to try it out, I'll change the text to Hello Rob, and the ID we don't actually need at this point, but we will need it later on to be able to refer to this text view in our code and maybe change it or make it appear or disappear or bigger or smaller or whatever we want to do to it. So I'll call it Hello Rob text view for now. And then you can see that update straight away. And let's just have a quick run of the app. We'll choose our emulator that I've created a couple of videos ago, just to make sure that the change that we've made here is reflected in the app itself. And there we go. So that has updated. I've also got a message that Instant Run has been applied to the current activity. Instant Run is a new feature in Android Studio 2, which makes running changes to your app much quicker. So if, for example, I wanted to change this to Hello Dave, you can then see that the play symbol has got a little lightning next to it. And if I then click that and go back to the emulator, then it's not exactly instant, but it's pretty quick. And what happens is it's just that activity is updated and restarted, which means that when you're testing around playing with an app, you don't have to relaunch the whole app, waiting 30 seconds or so for the app to update. So it's really great for experimenting and tinkering, although if you make major changes to your app, it will, in many cases, have to do the full relaunch. But for now, this will definitely save us a lot of time as we're experimenting with text views. So for now, I'm going to hide the log area at the bottom because we don't really need it. And let's zoom out a little bit there. All right, so let's just first see how we can add a new text view if we want to. So we just drag in from the left-hand side, and then you can see as we drag it around, we're given various options. You may remember I mentioned a relative layout a couple of videos ago, and this is what we're working with. So we're dragging it in to our relative layout. So for example, if I laid it there, that will be aligned to the parent, which is the dotted orange box around the edge there on the left, and it will be aligned below the Hello Dave label. So if I now drag Hello Dave down, then the new text view is dragged down with it. I'm going to use Command Z to undo that, take it back to where we were before, and Command Z again to get rid of the new text view. And let's just drag it in again and just see what the options are, and just spend a bit of time messing around with this so we can align it to the top right, for example. So there is the top and right of the parent, i.e. in this case the relative layout, the container. If I drag it down a bit, then that's aligned to the top of the Hello Rob text view, or it could be aligned to the bottom of the Hello Rob text view, or I can center it in the middle. I can center it vertically as well, etc., etc. So this is now centered in the middle of the activity. And if I switch, for example, to a Nexus 10 tablet view, then it's still centered in the middle of the screen. So actually that makes making apps for different screen sizes pretty straightforward, because you know if it's centered in this way, it's going to be centered on every device. So that's very simply how we can change the layout of our app when we're dragging in new widgets. We'll see that in much more detail later on as we build more complex app layouts. For now though, let's get rid of that text view and go back to our Hello Dave as it is now. And when you want to customize a widget, it's this properties area that you're going to be spending most of your time. So I'm not going to go into these in massive detail. As you can see, there's lots of them, but I'll just pick out the most important ones for now. So the width, first of all, this is the width of the whole of the text view. So at the moment, wrap content is just the width of the content. But I could change it to, for example, fill the parent, and that would then fill the relative layout, which is the parent for this text view. Same with the height. I can use fill parent or match parent. In this case, they're the same thing because there are no other elements in the relative layout, which is the parent for our text view. So now I've got a very big text view. As you can see, that's the same, but I'll go back to wrap content, which is usually what you're going to want for a text view. We can add in margins if we want. So for example, I could add a margin of 10 dps, and you can see that's now moved it to the right and down. It's worth getting clear what a dp is. A dp is short for density independent pixel, and a dp is essentially 1/160th of an inch. So 160 dps are roughly 1 inch on any Android device. So when you're designing your layouts, DPs are almost always the best option to use. If for some reason you need to be extremely precise, you can use px for pixels, but that's generally quite a bad idea because it won't scale well on different devices. So use DPs for almost all measurements, except for an exception that we'll see in a moment. Now with margins, of course, we could set them all to 10 dp, or we could, for some reason, set the left margin to 30 and the top margin to 60. You can see that you get that effect there. And again, let's just remind ourselves that we can use the lightning refresh to see that in action. And there we go. That's happened nice and quickly. Okay, so clicking back on the text view, here you can change the alignment of the text view. That's all reasonably straightforward, so I'm not going to look at that in much detail now, but it's worth looking at the style here. So we can pick a particular style, or we can click on the menu, so the 3 dots there, to pick one of the many styles that comes with the theme that we're working with. So you can see there's loads of different styles there, and that will just bring in a bunch of default sizes, colors, and in some cases margins and layouts as well. So again, feel free to experiment with that. So for example, if I just go for large, then that will set a bunch of those styles for me. And there's a big advantage to doing that, because that means that specific devices can set appropriate settings for those styles. You're letting the device choose how your app displays, which is often a good idea because it means your app will display well on that device. But sometimes you might want to be very specific about how your app is styled, and then you might want to specify it yourself. Moving down, we've got the alpha. Now this is a very useful way of making your user interface elements transparent. So if, for example, I put 0.5 in as the alpha, you can see that that fades slightly. And what it's essentially doing is becoming transparent. So if there was an image behind that, I would start to see the image through the text. We'll be using alpha in many places in the course, but we'll just leave it as the default for now. Jumping now to background. So again, looking at the options in the 3 dots, that's how I'd recommend using a background. I can now choose from a whole range of colors. I'll go for a sort of yellowy, muddy sort of a background. And there we go. So you can see we've got a nice yellow background, and it might be clearer now if I do an alpha of 0.5, possibly. That's now slightly yellow. So that's how we set the background color. There's some more options for the background if we want to there. I'm going to jump through these ones. Font is obviously pretty useful. It's nice to be able to choose a particular font. So we've got loads of fonts there. I'll just choose one at random. Looks pretty much like what I had before. And gravity is essentially alignment within the element. So if, for example, I change the width to go full width, other than the margin, of course, I can then change my gravity to align to the right. And as you can see, there's various other options for gravity as well, with centering, filling, etc., etc. So gravity is how you align your element content within the element itself. I can change the height. We've got the ID, as we saw before. Some various options for input, which we don't really need here. Letter spacing. If there are links within it, we can choose whether to make those clickable or not. Then we've got maximum, minimum heights. We've got some padding, which is much like a margin, but it's within the element itself. So if you've got a background, it's useful to have a little bit of padding so it doesn't go all the way to the edge of the element. Various other options. We can change the text from there if we want to. Change the text color. So once again, if we click on the three dots, we can change that to, let's go for a red bit of text. And we can change the text size. And this is the one exception that I mentioned earlier to DPs, and I'd recommend using SPs for text. So if we change this to something like 20 SP, then it turns out to be a little bit smaller than the default that we had there. Now an SP is short for scale independent pixel, and essentially it's the same as DP, but it's also affected by the user's setting for the text zoom level. So if, for example, a user wants to have all of their text a little bit bigger, they can set that in the Android default settings, and the SP will then be affected by that. So again, it will need your design to be a little bit more fluid, but it will be more usable by the user if they need larger text. Because they're visually impaired, then that will be reflected in your text if you use SPs. So essentially the shorthand is to use DPs for everything except text, and then use SPs for text only. Then we've got some more options for style, theme, and width at the bottom there as well. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I would thoroughly recommend playing with these in a little bit more detail and just working out how they all fit together. For now though, I'm going to give you a quick challenge, and that is to recreate this text view here. So it's centered, it's got a nice bit of padding, it's pretty big. The text itself is just off black and the background is green. So nothing too tricky there. You should be able to recreate that using what we've just learned. So I'll give you a moment to pause the video and make the text view. Go for it. Okay, I hope that went well. So I'm going to start by dragging in my text view. And we wanted it centered, so I'm going to go for centered at the top, and I'll start by double clicking to change the text to my great app. Fabulous. And then let's start by changing the text size. So I'll go for something nice and big, 50 SP. That looks great. And I'll change the text color as well. I'll go for that dark, pretty much black color. Great. And then we want to add in a bit of a background. So let's choose the green that I suggested. There we go. Lovely green background. And finally, a bit of padding. So scroll down to padding, and of course DPs for padding. There we go. So very quick exercise. Doesn't look beautiful obviously, but it gives us an opportunity to just practice the various customizations that we've just learned. Excellent. So that's fairly thorough introduction to text views. In the next video, we're going to go on and look at buttons, and this is where we'll actually start writing some code as well and start making our apps interactive.